Welcome, Mr. Maguire. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. I want to start by explaining who our members are, the community service coordinators who often they support tenants and they help plan and deliver various programs at the TCHC, and tenants service coordinators that deal with everything around rentals. Our members are often former tenants of TCHC, and whether they are or they're not, or they care about the tenants at TCHC and they want to be part of the solution to ensure that Toronto community housing succeeds. I want to deal mostly with recommendation number 1, which we think is the most important recommendation in this report. We're pleased that this recommendation is here, and it says, City Council, as the ultimate owner of 58,500 rental units through its sole shareholder corporation, commit to Toronto community housing, achieving the distinction of being a landlord of choice with a reputation for good repair, cleanliness, and safe and healthy buildings. This recommendation, if followed, will give tenants the housing they deserve and should be the city's primary goal. So we're pleased about that recommendation. What's not pleasing, though, and unfortunately the report really doesn't lay out a plan, a clear path to succeed in that commitment. We need a path to invest properly in social housing. In fact, the budget direction for the TCHC from the city for 2017 to cut 2.7% in the face of almost $100 million in growing costs goes in the opposite direction. Our response to the task force is meant to provide some clear markers to help create that path to making TCHC a social housing landlord of choice. We looked to New York in our research, in our report. The Housing Authority in New York is 4 times the size of Toronto and facing many of the same challenges. Yet they have transformed their housing, their public housing, by putting proper funding in place, by ramping up repairs and allowing tenants to track progress on their specific requests in real time, and they created a successful model of decentralizing operations, local community decision-making within the New York Housing Authority in a structure 4 times the size of TCH. These are the kind of opportunities we need to look at, how a large public housing authority can work to be a housing provider of choice. New York seems to have done it. Let's be next. That's it.
Thanks, Mr. Maguire. I have a couple of questions, if I could. I trust you would acknowledge that number one recommendation about being the best landlord and so on, that it is possible that one of the ways to get there is through implementing some of the other recommendations, including, what's the word I'm looking for, the transfer of some of the units to a new nonprofit and/or existing nonprofits. I mean, and the decentralization and so on. I trust you to acknowledge that when you say that isn't addressed, there are things in there that are meant to do exactly what you said.
There are possibilities of that happening, but it seems inherent in the report that those, due to the differences in funding, per unit funding, the opportunities for those others to succeed with a different level of funding. It's all about funding. So funded TC, I understand those recommendations are there to transfer units. Those are going to be funded at one level, and let's make sure that TCHC is set up to succeed as well. But also, and from a bargaining agent perspective, there are still issues that have to be solved in those issues as well.
I understand that. I understand that. Okay, Councillor Cressy.
Thank you, Tim. I just want to pick up on something you mentioned there. So as part of the transfer, the proposed transfer in a limited format, if there was a common performance standard, which is to say certainty that there would not be 2 tiers of funding and 2 tiers of performance, would that help to alleviate those concerns of resulting in transfers being at a higher tier than the maintained 48,000 units for TCH?
Yes, I think so. I mean, obviously, we're not pleased that some of that housing might go to other providers, and we want to make sure that the services are still there, but we can't disadvantage TCHC in the process. Right.
Okay, so some certainty related to that common performance. Now, one other piece that I think, and I didn't hear you articulate it specifically, but related to a limited scale transfer would be successor rights as part of a direction for a potential implementation of this to be considered, right?
Yes. Okay. I mean, That's essential for us in terms of looking at how the people that provide those services are treated.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? We had Councillor Perks.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on the mayor's question. Did you see any recommendation in here to increase the funding directly to TCHC?
No.
No? But in the report it does say, if I remember, that the TCHC funding model is broken. You recall it saying that? It does. So,
Yes.
yeah. In your remarks, you mentioned that TCHC doesn't receive as much money per unit as other housing providers?
I understand the TCHC per unit funding is half that of other providers.
Half that. So do you think a way that maybe without creating all kinds of new entities and rejigging the organization for what, the 5th time in 6 years, if we simply provided the same level of funding to a unit in TCHC as we provide to other housing providers, that might go a long way towards meeting this recommendation 1?
That would.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Perks. We have Councillor Davis.
I just wondered if you have been involved in the consultation process in, directly through stakeholder consultations as opposed to just broad?
We've been consulted with in the initial Mayor's Task Force gathering information. We were consulted, labor consultations, and since the initial report, we've been consulted with, yes.
So the union has been consulted on the preparation of this report?
Yes, and we put in a position paper, actually. It counters many of the recommendations, but we had an opportunity to say so.
Okay. I'm wondering, there's a recommendation for a steering committee. I'm wondering if you think it would make sense to have the union represented on the steering committee.
We would be willing to partake if that was the judgment of council.
Thank you.
All set, Councillor Davis? Okay, thanks. Councillor DeGiorgio? Councillor DeGiorgio?
Yep, thank you, Mr. Mayor. In the report, there's this notion of performance standards being set, and then looking at different providers or different delivery mechanisms or different delivery groups that might meet those performance standards and that the quality of life for people living in affordable homes. Are you okay with looking at alternative delivery providers that meet that performance standard?
We don't prefer looking at alternative service delivery of public service. We prefer that public service be delivered by public servants.
But there are charitable organizations that deliver public service.
Right.
And I think one of the recommendations that was put forward in this report that we look at segregating 5,000 TCHC units and having a different provider deliver the services as a way of comparing the ability of a different provider versus TCHC, which is a much larger organization, to see whether in fact there might be better ways of delivering service. Are you opposed to that?
We're not in favor of parallel services being set up as a measure to compare to the public sector and then bring down to the public sector. But particularly in this situation, as it's currently set, other providers would be provided with more funding to outcompete with the public sector. I think in any service that the city delivers, whether it be childcare, whether it be social housing, the core of that service should be the public sector. And we understand that in both childcare and in social housing, there are other providers, but the standard should be set by the public sector. And we shouldn't underfund it in order to allow others to succeed.
Your understanding is that the financing received by, let's say, some other charitable organization that delivers affordable housing is much higher in terms of, let's say, financing on a per capita basis is much higher than what TCHC receives in funds?
Yes, and I think that's the core of their issue. We've met with our members, and they understand some of the, for instance, service issues that are out there in Toronto's communities, and they want to be part of the solution. And part of that solution is looking at models which could have more community reaction to some of the issues that are happening in the communities, and we're completely supportive of that in bringing up the standards of both the building and the services that are provided, but they need to be funded.
Okay. The flip side of the coin then is to sort of just say, well, look, TCHC, they just don't have enough money to meet or to satisfy the the performance standards. So let's just throw more money at it and hopefully we'll raise the performance standards. That's basically what you're advocating?
I would suggest there hasn't been enough money thrown at TCHC.
I'm not suggesting there hasn't been enough money. All I'm saying is, why not in the process of throwing more money, can we not look at alternative ways of using equivalent amounts of money to see whether in fact those performance standards can be satisfied?
And that'll be your last question. Please go ahead and answer, Mr.
I misunderstood the question. I'm actually not clear what the question is.
Okay, don't worry about it.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Other questions of Mr. Maguire, if any? Councillor Bailão?
Tim, you recognize the report says it and recognizes that this has been an unfunded, it's not only a capital issue, which we've been talking about for a few years, that there's actually an operational issue, and the report acknowledges that. And that part of the moving into a 70-30 model has to do with that, right? There's a financial benefit to it.
Yes, and we understand that we support the move to a 70-30. We want to make, we also would indicate that in the report it talks about having less RGI at TCHC, and I don't know that that's a goal that we should be pursuing.
I understand, but the goal of having a better social mix and an economic mix will have a better impact in the delivery of services and the operating budget of TCHC.
Yes, completely support that recommendation.
Okay. And one of the things that I think the report tries to do is not only working and improving TCHC, but is actually touching on the sector as a whole. So actually strengthening the sector. And one of the big goals by creating this new nonprofit is to create something that doesn't exist right now in Toronto. We have 30,000 units that are delivered by the nonprofit, but we have TCHC with 58,000 units and then everybody else less than 1,000 units. So if we can actually strengthening a bit the nonprofit and increase the number of housing providers that have a few more units, that actually we're strengthening the sector by doing that.
I understand your point. But I think that...
Don't you think that's better for the delivery of housing, period, in Toronto?
I don't know that you need to take units from TCHC to do that. You can just have more social housing in the city.
And we can do both. And we can do both.
Yeah, I'm not going to articulate that I concur with units going from the TCHC to other units. I know that that's a recommendation that's being pursued, but I can't articulate that I support that.
Okay.
Councillor Bailão, thank you. Any other councillors wishing to ask questions? Okay, well, Mr. Maguire, thanks very much. We appreciate your time.